Welcome back, everyone. Let me introduce our keynote speaker, Harrison Hong. Harrison is the John Acol Jr. Professor of Financial Economics at Columbia University. He received his PhD in economics from MIT. Before joining Columbia, he was the John Scully 66 Professor of Economics and Finance at Princeton University. And he has contributed to a number of topics in financial economics, especially on behavioral finance and stock market efficiency. His work on disagreements, bubbles and crashes, friction arbitrage, and corporate sustainability and climate change risks have been published in different top economics and finance journals. So today, Harrison is going to give a talk about mitigating disaster risks in the age of climate change. Harrison, we have 40 minutes. Maybe you can talk for 35 minutes and we have 5 minutes for questions.
Great, thanks a lot.
All right, the floor is yours.
Thanks for everyone for sticking around. I put a talk together that is predominantly based around some new work I'm doing with Nang Wang at the Columbia Graduate School of Business and Jinshan Yang at the Shanghai University of Finance of course, on disaster risk. But the talk itself, I'm going to try to be a bit broader than that paper and just reflect on this very horrible year that we're all living through. I mean, obviously, you have the pandemic, and I think in the US, for the second year in a row, the Western US states have these wildfires, and I think we're currently going through in the Atlantic. Probably, I think we're going to break the record for the number of hurricanes this year. So let me start with just a statement that, I think in the last few years, climate scientists have, I think, predominantly now converged on the view that climate change is making weather disasters more severe, and that, going forward, it's likely going to be even worse. So, if you look at the last couple of papers in the PNAS on increased frequency and severity of Atlantic hurricanes, I read some papers in 2005. I think there was a lot more debate, certainly about the frequency, whether or not climate change was leading to, global warming was leading to kind of more frequent Atlantic hurricanes. But I think that ship has now sailed. I think there's now basically more consensus that you have potentially some pretty bad states out there in the future if there's no mitigation, or if there's no, if global temperature is not controlled. Certainly in the Western US wildfires, there's now pretty good evidence, especially in the states of California, Oregon, and Washington, that these droughts that are linked to climate change are having a pretty severe consequences for these US wildfires. And we know that from models of disasters in macro, that the welfare loss of such events are likely to be high. So just think about typical tail hurricane events that in the Atlantic, kind of some extreme events are like 1% to 2% of Atlantic housing stock, right? Once every 40 years. And if you look at kind of the models that, Barrow and my co-author, Nung, has done with Pindyke, these sorts of disaster models can generate a pretty high willingness to pay to avoid these disasters for two reasons. And first, the shocks are permanent because they'll destroy some capital. So think about hurricanes and wildfires, for instance. And second, of course, are risk preferences that, I think if we take seriously some of the stuff people have done in macro finance, risk preferences, plus these permanence of these shocks suggest pretty high welfare losses going forward. And I think kind of our entry into this is that, and I think climate scientists kind of understand this, is that, I think most of our preoccupation of thinking about climate change research has been, and I think rightly, on emissions control and carbon taxes at a global level, which are of course, very important. But at the same time, even if these things were implemented, you would still basically have many decades where you have to still deal with these disasters. I mean, it's not as if, emissions control is going to suddenly turn the world back per se, in a very short period of time. And so our view is that, probably more research. I think it's, relatively speaking, more research needs to be done on regional level disaster mitigation and thinking about the costs and benefits of that going forward, because, it's going to these sorts of mitigation activities will likely play a key role. Okay, so there's some key questions that we'll try to focus on. So first is what determines mitigation, of course. Second is what are the welfare laws with and without mitigation. Okay, and I think that the contrast of the two is super important. And then finally, what are the tax and asset pricing implications? Okay. So this is the paper. I mean, it's still kind of undergoing some revision, but I think we're kind of converging on a draft that is readable. So this is sort of what we try to do. We're going to propose a model of regional level mitigation, where mitigation spending essentially limits fat tail damages to capital stock along the lines that I've sort of talked about earlier. There's going to be two features that we think are important in terms of quantifying these effects. So first is when a disaster arrives, that's going to change the perceived risk of households, and that's going to change then the value of mitigation. Okay, so I think one of the things that's important to point out is that going forward, as we do these calculations and trying to figure out welfare laws, I think there is naturally going to be a lot of learning by society going forward. Just look at the last 10 years, for instance. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I think that the scientific consensus on hurricanes in 2005, as I said, was mixed, but the last 15 years or so, that consensus has changed as more evidence has arrived to inform and to refine the climate models. Second, of course, the model also features, and I think this is important, an under provision of mitigation in competitive markets due to externalities. John Hasler, who's discussed in earlier papers, has done sort of important work on this in the context of emissions controls. There's going to be a similar notion of externalities when it comes to the provision of mitigation, such as seawalls, et cetera. Okay. So what we're going to use the model for is to quantify. I'm going to do an application. The model is fairly generic in the sense that it could be applied to a number of different scenarios. But just to make things very concrete, we're going to focus on quantifying the value of mitigation in terms of seawalls to guard against more frequent Atlantic hurricanes. Okay, so I'm going to imagine the model is about these Atlantic hurricane states, which is about 40% of U.S. GDP, and so that they realistically need to deal with these issues going forward. And we calculate, and we're going to focus particularly on housing stock, just to make things much more concrete again. So we calculate some willingness to pay to avoid hurricanes, something on the order of 25% of housing stock, and I'll talk about the scenarios that we're calculating. The value of mitigation of these seawalls is about 15%. So that is, you're going to do significantly better, essentially, with these mitigation activities. To fund the seawalls, it's going to be 1.5% of the housing capital tax to fund the mitigation. Is on kind of an ongoing basis, an annual tax on top of whatever, of course, taxes that. And the Atlantic coastal property in a competitive setting is about 8% too high compared to the first pass. Right, so that's kind of the economics I'm going to articulate in this talk, and then I'll try to use some of these numbers to guide some of the recent work on trying to understand the relationship between housing prices in these coasts and climate risk. All right, so there's, I mean, I think sort of a broad goal that we want to do is related to some estimates that, I mean, and certainly this is in the literature. So if you read scientific journals like Nature and Science, there are a lot of estimates about these long run damages associated with these disasters. So in that sense, we're not going to be the first people to give you some estimates. But I'm going to point out, I think, a few things that are very, very important. So let's take probably among the most famous of the papers is the Shang-Jina paper. So they basically, the way, and I think typically most of the science papers model weather disasters, it's along something like a productivity shock that affects long run GDP growth. Okay. And I think this is kind of the wrong model, actually. Certainly it's the wrong model to think about the US. I mean, it could be okay model for thinking about developing countries, because, there, I think these countries there are probably more fragile, and I think there are these kind of long run effects. But I view that, if you're going to want to quantify these sorts of disasters, these weather disasters, sort of a disaster model is a lot better than a labor supply model, where, some disaster affect long run labor supply and affect like long run productivity growth. I just don't think that makes, I think it's okay and it makes some sense, and certainly you can kind of get estimates from that, but I think it's certainly useful to think about probably a better model to match, I think, what's going on in the data. So for instance, the developing countries, the Shang-Yin estimates are something like the mean estimate is $10 trillion globally, absent mitigation, and sort of what is called the business as usual thing. But of course, I think the other thing with these estimates is that the models of mitigation are not very good, right? Which is super important to understand, right? That typically most of these estimates, are not really so focused. They're mostly focused on the business as usual. So I think, there's some value in the estimate, but I think, modeling the mitigation is actually fairly important. Okay, and as far as I can tell, there hasn't been too much work, I think, on linking mitigation to kind of getting these numbers. And in fact, in these models, in these estimates, the way people think about mitigation is that it's changing the path of temperature from a business as usual scenario, which I view as being pretty far away from what would realistically happen in a world of climate change. Which, you should think about building seawalls, you should think about land use regulation, et cetera. Okay. All right. So just to make things super concrete, this is a picture of the the primary kind of Atlantic hurricanes, which I sort of recently read up on. So there's about 46,000 miles on the Atlantic hurricane because of all the jaggedness. There are basically low-lying areas at risk of sea level rise and storm surges. Okay. And so in the last probably 120 years, there's been about probably 2 major landfall hurricanes per year. Okay. And then like the average of the top 6 most damaging hurricanes are about 1 or 2% of the housing stock in the Atlantic. So right now, let's just take that number to be about $17 trillion. Okay, and you can quibble with these numbers a little bit. NOAA produces these numbers. And my sense is actually on the tail events, the numbers probably are a bit higher because basically, the estimates are we know sort of from lawsuits after the fact that the numbers tend to be kind of more higher than the official numbers. And here's sort of the mitigation strategy that's on the table, which are these seawalls. This is a picture the New York Times produced. So in New York City right now, we're thinking about a $119 billion seawall for about 6 miles. And so the seawall basically is a little bit outside. And I think this is the nice one. This is the one that I think the Netherlands use with some nice retractable gates and everything, so that you can kind of mitigate these storm surges. Okay. There are other estimates, and of course, on the table is exactly what's called a high tide tax. Like, who's going to pay for the seawall for the Atlantic region? So there's a report out that has some other estimates for a seawall. They're a little bit cheaper, probably $50 million per mile. And if we just take these numbers and we amortize this, and I think typically there's some depreciation, so you have to spend 5 to 10% on maintenance on these seawalls. We're talking about proposals that are anywhere from about 81 basis points to about 4% of capital stock per year for these types of mitigation activities. Okay, so the question is, do these proposals make sense? How do we make sense of all these numbers, right? To relative to the risk that society faces. Okay. All right, so the model we're going to do will be the following. We're going to do an AK model. Some people in macro like it, some people in macro don't like it. I think actually for the purposes that we're doing, I think it's okay. So you can think about K as capital stock, as its housing capital stock, and what people consume in terms of output are these housing services, and A is some productivity parameter. So it's a typical AK model, except for one thing we introduced, which is X, which is this mitigation spending. So, with these output, you can consume, you can make some investments, you have to pay for some adjustment costs of capital. And then the big thing is really this mitigation spending X. You can also deploy some of it to have some of these seawall. Okay. So the risk that the economy faces will evolve like this. So you're going to get your standard capital stock equation that evolves. You make some investments, capital stock grows. There's a little bit of some diffusion shock associated with. You might think some homes are just going to be outdated and you need to replace it. And then the big thing is really this DJ process. This is a Poisson process that arrives where a hurricane arrives, and then you're going to basically lose some fraction, 1 minus Z of your capital stock. Okay, so Z will be this recovery rate, and the way we'll kind of model the damage will be that Z is going to follow. This is this recovery fraction. It's going to have some cumulative distribution function and some density function. Okay, and so Z is going to follow some power law that we'll use to calibrate the data. Okay. So there's going to be 2 possible states of the world. So you can think about the good state as something maybe in the past, okay, where you're getting maybe 1 to 2 arrival rates of hurricanes per year, and then lambda b will be the bad state, okay, and these two states are absorbing states, and so there'll be some learning that goes on based on the arrival of these disasters about what state of the world that we're in. Okay. Otherwise, standard adjustment, capital adjustment cost function, that's widely used, and the mitigation technology will work like this. So you're going to get some recovery fraction Z. The more you spend on mitigation, the more you get the recovery of your capital stock when a hurricane arrives. Okay, and the way we'll kind of parameterize it is in the following way: the density or the CDF of the recovery distribution is going to depend on your pre-jump spending, little xt minus. That's going to be basically just your mitigation spending divided by the pre-jump capital stock. And the way we sort of parameterize the function is that if the mitigation spending doubles, the benefit of mitigation also doubles, okay, which seems sort of reasonable. And then the domain of the recovery distribution, the recovery variable will be between 0 and 1. Otherwise, we'll use sort of the standard Epstein-Zine recursive utility. And as I'll talk about, this is predominantly very important because we want to get some risk preferences that we have a sense for as being sort of realistic. Again, the most important parameter here will be this side parameter, the elasticity of intertemporal substitution, which is mostly important actually for asset pricing implications. It's not so important for the welfare loss calculations, as I'll point out in a second. Okay. So let's talk about the solution. So first, you solve the filtering problem. The reason we chose, of course, this sort of a Poisson learning process is two things. First, it's going to keep the model fairly tractable, and second, we don't have to estimate any parameters when it comes to the other than basically picking what's a bad state scenario, lambda b. Okay, so the way that the filtering works is that pi t, which is really this is the main state variable. When a disaster arrives, you're going to basically update on how likely now is the bad state. Okay. And so learning model, of course, is going to generate time varying stochastic arrival rates as far as these hurricanes. So the point is that in some years, you may think after a couple of arrivals, wow, the world is really bad. But then, maybe in some other years when arrivals have been less than what you expected, you might think maybe things are okay. This is all allowed in the model, right? When we do these welfare calculations. Okay, so you can kind of calculate pi as sort of a martingale. And so the way the updating works is, the second basically a disaster arrives, there's a jump in your state variable pi. But otherwise, when no disaster arrives, you're going to just deterministically drift back to your prior. Okay. So this is a picture of how the updating is going to work. The red dots represent the arrival of some of these hurricanes, and you'll see that starting at a prior 0.1, you start drifting down, and then suddenly when a disaster comes, you pop up, okay, and then you kind of drift down again, and then you pop up. So if there's a cluster of arrivals, you're going to then basically kind of move up fairly quickly in terms of the learning process, okay. And this is completely rational and Bayesian updating in a world where, and this is, I think, kind of important and I think relatively new to the literature. Disasters are discrete signals, okay. Therefore, this is the rational updating process. And kind of one thing to note is in the environmental literature, there's a lot of discussion of what's called overreaction after disasters arrives. But I think that sort of is a little bit misplaced because I think if people are updating on discrete signals, you should expect some degree, just rationally, of overreaction in the sense that if no other disaster arrives, people basically drift back down in terms of their beliefs. But I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the learning. I think there's actually a number of interesting things in the learning model that would be very informative for learning, to talking about the disaster and environmental literature, but that's not really the main goal of the paper. Otherwise, you can write down your HAB equation. Sort of, the two new pieces, of course, is this pi state variable, and then, of course, the jumps, right, which will basically create this change in the value function. And this is where you get a lot of the bite when it comes to these welfare loss calculations. But otherwise, you get your standard investment, first order condition, your usual one. The only new first order condition we're introducing is basically X the mitigation, which is essentially you're going to choose mitigation such that you equate the marginal benefit of mitigation with the cost of consumption, of course. And the interesting thing is that basically by changing X, you're going to change the aggregate risk in the economy. Okay, so you can view this as a first order condition from the planner's perspective, and you can also view this as we've modeled mitigation as an externality in the sense that individual households are not going to want to do any of this stuff, right, because of this externality. Just to kind of make things a little more concrete, we'll model the recovery distribution Z as a power law. So basically, it's going to be Z to the beta X. So X is controlling the beta, which is governing basically your recovery distribution. So a couple of key notations. L pi will be your expected capital loss per jump. Okay, and then G will be your growth rate. And so what happens in the economy is that when a disaster arrives, you're going to lose some fraction of your capital, right? And then your growth rate then, your unexpected growth rate then will just be your investment minus then how frequently these disasters arrive and the conditional loss per jump. Right? How many jumps you have and the conditional loss per jump. So all the formulas are fairly nice and transparent, relatively easy to sort of work with. And then we're going to make things a little bit more for calibration and quantitative purposes. We're going to work with beta X as a linear function. So that then we only have to calibrate really kind of two parameters, beta 0, which is in a world without mitigation, and then basically beta 1, which is the mitigation parameter. Okay. And then for the capital adjustment cost, we're going to just assume standard convex adjustment cost. All right. And finally, let's talk about the value functions. So in this setup, you can still keep all the nice properties so that the model is essentially highly tractable. You don't have to deal with PDEs. You're mostly dealing with still ODEs. And you can get the value function for mitigation. The big thing is little b pi, which is the certainty equivalent with and without mitigation. So this is b pi and then b hat pi, right? And it's telling you basically how your value function is changing as your perceived risk changes with pi, both with and without mitigation. Okay. There's a market failure in the model. So the competitive equilibrium solution is not corresponding to the planner solution unless there's no mitigation technology that's available, right? So the welfare theorems don't hold in this model, and the SDF of the mitigated economy and the SDF of the competitive economy are not the same. Okay. So therefore, and the reason is just we model the mitigation as reducing aggregate risk, which itself is basically building in this externality. We have in the paper, of course, you can also basically make mitigation a non-externality as well. But I think the interesting thing for us is really the externality aspect that reflects sort of these seawalls and whatnot. All right, and then finally, we're going to calculate welfare loss. So there's kind of two notions. So one is the welfare loss is, how much does your welfare change as your perceived risk changes, both with and without mitigation. And then the bigger thing we want to calculate is really the value of mitigation, right? So we can compare basically how much money would you be willing to give up for mitigation. Okay, so this is zeta pi number. Okay, so we're going to be interested in calculating tau pi, tau hat pi with and without mitigation, and then the zeta pi. Okay. All right. I think for this type of models, actually, this is fairly, that's not that many parameters, so I can kind of talk you through it. So first thing is the elasticity of intertemporal substitution. This, as I said, this parameter is probably more important for the asset pricing than anything else. So we'll set it to 1.1. Probably a natural benchmark is something like 1. And in the long run, the risk literature guys try to jack it up to 1.5. I think our perspective is 1.5 is probably most macro guys would probably think it's a little bit too high, a little bit too crazy. Something around 1, maybe kind of okay. Then the power law exponent with no mitigation, we're going to set beta 0 to be 246. So what this means is you're going to get conditional on the arrival of, this is to match the fat tail of the hurricane distribution. So that, per jump, it's about a 40 basis points of damage to capital stock. So which is sort of reasonable given historical data. We're going to set, just to be conservative, we're going to set lambda G to be 1. So there's kind of one major hurricane in the past. This is like the good state. This is like the before climate change world. Right? And then, of course, climate change means we're still learning about where we will be. So I'm going to set lambda b to be 10 as sort of like the worst parameter you can think of. And then, of course, pi will moderate where we are in terms of how bad global warming is. Now, the time rate of preference, productivity, quadratic adjustment cost parameters, coefficient of relative risk aversion, capital diffusion volatility. We're going to target these to match these moments of the risk-free rate, housing return risk premium, housing market volatility, expected growth rate, and Tobin's Q in the housing market. Okay. And then finally, the mitigation technology, the way we'll do it is we're going to pick beta 1 such that in the good state, you don't spend any money on mitigation. Okay. So that basically kind of tells you how, it helps pin down sort of how efficient is the mitigation technology. Right. Okay. So let's talk about the numbers then. So I think that's sort of the main point is to get some estimates of these hurricanes. On the x-axis is pi, that's our mainstay variable. Okay. First thing, let's talk about the red line. The red line is the competitive economy, okay, with no mitigation, right? Okay. So as I said, we've calibrated so that one hurricane means about a 40 basis points conditional on a hurricane is about a 40 basis point damage to capital stock on average. Of course, there's a fat tail. So if we think about the world as, let's think about where we are right now in the world, which is maybe like a 0.2 or something, where we think, it's bad, but, maybe not super bad yet. You're still getting a pretty substantial drop in terms of welfare, right? So the red line you're dropping without mitigation is like almost 0.3 at a pi of 0.2. And then the growth rate, you're beginning to basically see growth rates now that will be affected because of these arrivals of these disasters. Now, if you mitigate, okay, you do a lot better, right? So, at 0.2, your value of mitigation is something like, 0.15. This is a zeta pi parameter. It's just telling you that, you would forgo 15% of your capital stock, basically for some value of mitigation. It's just really the difference between the blue line and the red line. Okay. So, and of course, the value is that you keep your growth rate higher because you're basically mitigating against these bad tail events, right? So your conditional damage really drops a lot, essentially, right? It drops you from 40 basis points per hurricane to about 20 basis points per hurricane of capital stock. Okay, and agents with these Epstein-Zine preferences really value, okay, this type of mitigation. All right. So I think these are new numbers, just to kind of flag it. So what does that mean? So if you're going to have 15% of 0.15, you can think about that as 0.15 of $17 trillion. That's sort of the value being generated by the seawall technology, which I think is a kind of a new estimate that I think is what we're bringing to the literature. So now let's think about the other more finer aspects of the calculation. So X is the mitigation spending as a function of pi. X is also the tax rate. Right. Okay. So basically X pi is basically at 0.2. You're talking about like a 1% housing tax to fund the mitigation. All right. One thing is kind of interesting to note, right? So of course, because you're paying for mitigation, you're going to invest less. And of course, the externality here is that building coastal homes, right, exposes the aggregate economy to a lot of risk, right? So you should tax basically these homes and fund mitigation. All right. So coastal property then, of course, relative to the competitive equilibrium, is going to be too high. Right? Coastal property prices are just too high in the competitive equilibrium compared to the planner's equilibrium. So some of the numbers we have, just a few things. So the 1% tax is obviously non-trivial for a lot of homeowners. But what's interesting is that actually the implications for home prices, which is captured by Q, is actually fairly modest. And the reason that's the case, of course, is that when people talk about taxes and all of this stuff, they mostly say, oh my God, I'm going to get a tax. They forget about all the benefits that the mitigation gives you, right? Which is it severely reduces risk. It improves welfare quite a bit. And actually, the asset pricing implications are surprisingly, this is something we had learned in the model, because I think there's a lot of discussion in policy circles about all of the bad things that will happen to financial markets should you have some taxes. but I think that misses like half the calculation, which is there's also a lot of benefits associated with that relative to the unmitigated economy. Okay, but of course there will be some price effects, right? But you know, those price effects have to basically be offset by the benefits associated with that. Now, we've picked at the psi, so these results is super sensitive to psi. Right? These results are not, you know, because of the welfare results are not so much. But basically, these asset pricing results are super sensitive to psi. And I think we picked numbers that I kind of plausibly believe. So there's just, you know, I don't think like, so basically what happens if you go for a very high psi 1.5, both lines will be really downward sloping. And I don't think that makes too much sense, I think, in this current context. I think that was used to mostly match the equity premium puzzle literature. But I find that that's sort of a different exercise. I mean, I think we learned something qualitative from the exercise, which is the importance of psi. But I think kind of realistically, this is probably a reasonable calibration. All right, so what are some takeaways for the empirical research? So one thing that the model does, of course, is that in reality, the world is probably somewhere between the red line and the blue line, right? If people anticipate some ability, right, some tax in the future, okay? So, you know, what the model says is that, you know, the actual behavior will probably be depending on the beliefs. So I think kind of the first comment about this plot is that actually more important in terms of household beliefs is really what they think about the taxes and when it will arrive, as opposed to necessarily the risk of these hurricane arrivals per se. Okay. If you kind of look, if you kind of take these numbers seriously. So you can kind of calculate then, kind of the red line is like a competitive market pricing for these homes, blue is the planner, and then you can calculate then, if you also allow for some anticipated arrival rate of taxes, you can then calculate the value and the actual value of capital with optimal taxation. So let me make a couple of other comments. So I'm going to try to relate this. So Jose Shankman and Andrew Coley and I have published a climate finance issue, and I think several of the papers were exactly about housing prices and climate risk. Okay, so I want to use this model to clarify a little bit of the results in some of those papers. So typically, my understanding of the papers, at least sort of I edited, is that the regressions trying to link home prices to sea level rise have typically given very muted results. I think that is consistent with our model in the sense that you could say that that's consistent with this Q right here, right? That, you know, unless you thought there was going to be a huge amount of unless psi was going to be really, really big, right? For reasonable values, this is sort of what you're getting. And even if you impose a tax, which is what a lot of people talk about, the effects are still not going to be enormous because basically, even if you go from a 0 to a 1, you're talking about the max price effect is something like 8%. Exactly because there's a lot of offsetting benefits, right? So, you know, detecting 8%, you know, I'm not sure exactly is doable, but I think the model offers some guidance in thinking about what ballpark numbers we should be really getting when we run these regressions to begin with. Right? Okay, I think, you know, so the papers are, I think, are very mixed. I think nobody's getting a very strong price effect, even though the New York Times keeps wanting to publish papers about how there's these mega price effects. But I'm not sure that if you write down like a fundamental model, you should be getting such huge price effects because there's a huge amount of benefits associated with mitigation. Okay, and then I'm going to close with I think kind of some comments from COVID. You know, I think basically when Nung and I and Jin-Chan started working this year, we started working on this paper we've talked about, and then sort of COVID came, and then we sort of talked. You know, we worked on a bunch of papers on COVID, and I thought that I learned quite a lot about having spent like really almost a whole year thinking about mitigating disasters, you know, whether it's like a pandemic or like a hurricane. I'll kind of reflect a little bit and kind of say a few of the lessons that I felt like I learned. First, I think, of course, you know, COVID's a bit easier because there's no 2-year fix for climate change. You know, in 2 years, we're going to get a vaccine and, you know, that's like a little bit like a climate moonshot and then things are over, right? So in this paper we have in the RFS, we look at kind of optimal mitigation strategies by firms to minimize the damage COVID on their earnings, just to keep their workers from being sick and whatnot. And sort of one of the things we learned is that, if the vaccine is very far away, people are much more aggressive in mitigation than if the vaccine were close, basically. Right? And I think that sort of makes a lot of sense. I think there's like a similar parable that, if you will, for thinking about mitigation and climate change, in the sense that I think, the ability of emissions taxes, the ability of some technology to really control or reverse where we are in the climate, there's no 2-year fix, right? And this is kind of really, really far away. And so what that means, of course, is that we need to think a lot more about other types of investments we have to make in terms of mitigation, whether it's like seawalls and other things. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks. Open up for questions.
Perfect. Let me first check with the panelists and see whether any of the panelists want to ask a question. So please raise your hand, and then we will ask you to unmute. Okay, so maybe I can go ahead to ask the first question where the others are still thinking about. What do you think about the belief heterogeneity when you try to make the decisions for the mitigation? So I think it applies to the disaster risk and also people's expectation about the risk from COVID and how much help they are going to get from vaccine.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the model obviously can talk to that, in the sense that it's I mean, let me show the plot again. So the way I think to kind of talk about miscalibrated household beliefs, of course, is share the screen. You can just read off of this plot. Right. So you can read off of this plot the beliefs part, right? So the x-axis is pi, right? And you can imagine the real world, the world of science, maybe pi is a 0.5, but everybody thinks pi is 0, right? That we're not in a bad state, right? That we think we're like pretty safe. This then, going along these lines, depending on whether you're in a competitive market economy world or in a blue world, will give you basically the impact of miscalibrated household beliefs on home prices. So for instance, I think the typical narrative will be like, well, if everybody thinks pi is 0, but the world is like pi equals 1, how bad off are we in terms of mispricing? Well, this red line will tell you, right? In this model, it's actually not quite a lot. Now, of course, like I said, this is completely like just driven by EIS. Right? You can kind of make this thing bigger if you want. So I think in that sense, that's kind of one. We're back to sort of a little bit with these risk preferences. So depending on kind of the risk preferences you're getting, you can have pretty modest effects on home prices associated with miscalibrated beliefs, right? Now, the other thing is really miscalibrated beliefs about, which I think of course are correlated, about taxes. Right, that users may think that, so in other words, like users may think, well, look, I know there's climate change, but the world will never be able to get their act together about ever implementing any type of policy, right? Exactly. That we're always going to stay on the red line. Okay, so if you basically now have policy disagreements about the extent to which these taxes can come, you can generate definitely more action. Right, so that would be something like, like I said, like 8% here, which is not trivial. I mean, I think it's not a small number, but it's also not like, what the model is basically trying to give you is a sense of what the magnitudes are, depending on, and of course you can pick your favorite parameters and get different magnitudes for that. Does that make sense? So that's the way I would.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. All right. Are there any other questions from the panelists? And I see that there are some questions from the Q&A list, so let me try to pick. So Charlotte Glasser asked you about the correlated shocks from the increased disaster corruption due to climate change and the pandemics. So when the two type of disaster interact, how do we how do we interpret this?
Oh, I see. Interesting. Yeah, no. So Charlotte, I think that's a good. So yeah, so here I'll point you. So here, I think in this model, there's only one disaster. Ian Martin and Pindyke have other papers where they entertain multiple disasters. When you have multiple disasters, there's some other trade-offs that one has to do. So I think that's kind of one answer is we don't really have multiple disasters in our model. We only have one disaster in this model. But I think it sounds like the question is also just simply about just in the data, right? To what extent the resilience of different countries in terms of mitigating these effects are correlated between like COVID versus kind of climate change. I think the model, this is not such a great model to talk about these sort of cross-sectional effects. I know that in the environmental literature, when you talk about mitigation, I think historically the literature has focused on the question of whether rich countries are better or have more ability to mitigate than poor countries. And I think that people believe there that that is true, and that if you look at the impact of disasters, frequency of disasters don't really vary that much across countries. But of course, the damages vary quite a bit per disaster, which I think people take to be some indirect evidence that poor countries are less able to mitigate compared to rich countries. I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, this is not particularly you could interpret our model in that way if you do the following thing. So, beta 1 is the kind of the key parameter. You could say that, look, some countries are endowed with a better beta 1 than other countries, right? That would be able to generate some of the cross-sectional effects that you're talking about, right? That, maybe some countries that are less corrupt are more efficient at mitigating, right, per dollar compared to other countries. But I think kind of a more interesting model that you would have to integrate, I think, some other aspects which we haven't done in the paper, like, for instance, some financial constraints, and then talk about the relative importance of like a beta 1 effect, which is kind of some type of endowment of technology effect, or some institutional, sometimes it's called institutional endowments of different countries versus some other kind of constraints that you might kind of model as well. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, thank you very much, Harrison, for the interesting keynote speech. And this is the end of the session for today and also for the conference. So I would like to thank all the presenters, discussants, and audience for the wonderful work. And I will hand over to Bo for a concluding remark.
Thank you, Harrison. Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, all the presenters and all the discussants and all the participants. This has been a great conference. We were very disappointed. When I say we, I mean the ECGI as well as the team in Stockholm, that we couldn't meet face to face, but this has worked incredibly well as a substitute. And it strikes me that there's a lot of interest in this topic. There's sort of a convergence of really rapid academic development at the same time that people outside academia are really interested in the topics. And the only time I can remember in my time in academia that I had that feeling was when I was a PhD student right after the internet bubble burst, when all of a sudden everybody was very interested in how people are not rational and what happens when people are not rational. And interesting observation is that Harrison was at the forefront of that development as well. Anyway, that was all I wanted to say. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I'm sure all the authors will look forward to hearing questions by email if you didn't have the chance to get a word in. And with that, I wish everybody a happy rest of the Sunday.
Thank you very much, Bo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.